Hi, my name is Vig, and my year's been a pretty miserable one like everyone else's, outside of maybe Zack Snyder fans who are, no hyperbole, just coming off one of the most successful social movements in modern American history. Pop some champagne, you crazy kids, and please don't hurt me. I spent my day running a few miles, crying, lying about one of those two things, and watching an Akira Kurosawa flick. And as YouTube's most prolific Japanese film critic, I thought it appropriate to impart some poignant thoughts on it. So let's uncork some cheap sake and dive right in. Akira Kurosawa, the guy who you all know created the black and white filter mode in the hit video game Ghost of Tsushima, was also one of three great Japanese filmmakers from the country's golden era of cinema. He's perhaps best known for his samurai flicks like Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, and Rashomon, and also Ran, Throne of Blood, and Kagemusha, and also Sanjuro, The Hidden Fortress, and you get the point. The dude directed a lot of banger samurai flicks. But he also made films from other different genres that are equally as great, if not better, like epic melodrama Ikiru, and my personal favorite, 1963's full-on film noir, High and Low. High and Low, or Heaven and Hell as its much better Japanese title roughly translates to, tells the story of wealthy shoe executive Kingo Gondo, who's blackmailed by a kidnapper into giving up millions in order to save his son's best friend. Under normal circumstances, this situation might not have been so dire, but moments before said kidnapping, Gondo mortgaged everything he owned in order to gain control over his company, leaving him with two quite desperate options. 1. Pay the ransom and go from riches to rags as he watches his entire life's work disappear, or 2. Do nothing and let the child potentially die. And from this moral quandary jumping off point, High and Low veers off into very, very interesting directions. I can't speak much about the film without overtly gushing over it. The opening scene is one of my favorites in all of cinema. The lead performance from legendary actor Toshiro Mifune is perhaps the best of his entire career, and the film's themes about class disparity in 1960s Japan are, well, how do I put this? Relevant? Not to mention, there will always be a special place in my heart for men who have a burning passion for women's shoes.
Women's shoes!
Women's shoes! My
Women's shoes!
diamond.
But I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'll cram that analysis into a 60-second Instagram reel for later. No, today I'd like to talk with you about phone conversations. So phone calls are pretty ubiquitous in film as in life. It's rare to have a film without a phone conversation than one with one. But when they're presented to us on screen, they're often kind of boring, or at the very least purely functional. They get the job done of revealing some important plot point and move on. And if the film calls for many such conversations, they can quickly get stale and repetitive. High and Low, as the Criterion box art suggests, is one of these films with many, many phone calls. Each conversation carries with it a different kind of weight as Gondo attempts to, with the aid of Yokohama PD, rectify the situation at hand. But what's really interesting to me is not the content of these conversations, although they are quite engaging on that front too, but rather how Kurosawa manages to keep each one fresh and unique by changing a few subtle things in their presentation. What are these things, you ask? Well, subscribe to my premium access to find out more about this topic, and kidding, we ain't going there, folks. Although, never say never. Here are some things to consider with each phone conversation in High and Low.
Okay, I'm listening. Let me get a pen.
Number 1, who's on call? Or more accurately, who do we see on screen listening in on the conversation? Through dramatic staging, we can roughly observe 3 distinct categories to watch for here. The first is solo, that is Gondo alone. Then there's family, Gondo plus his wife and close associates. And finally, surveillance, essentially Gondo, family, and the inspectors of Yokohama PD. Changing the scope of who's listening in on the conversation affects the emotional intensity of the scene. Solo is quite personal and highlights Gondo's alienation from others and being the lone real target of the whole ordeal. Adding his wife and associates into the mix bring a communal element and heighten the stakes by putting pressure on Gondo to do the right thing. And bringing in Yokohama PD almost turns the situation into a police procedural. We focus less on Gondo's personal emotional plight and more on trying to uncover clues to nail the kidnapper down.
子供が誰の子だろうとこっちは構わない。3000万円お前が出すんだ。なんだ。
Number 2, who can we hear? That is, can we hear both sides of the conversation or only one? In the first few calls, Gondo reacts to someone on the other end of the line, but we're kept halfway in the dark as to the content of this conversation because we don't hear the other person's voice. This builds intrigue and suspense not just for us, but also for the other characters left out on screen.
急ぐんだ。話を決めたら折り返し電話をくれ。今夜中に手付金は届ける。
Other times we do hear both sides. In the first call with the kidnapper, it's especially important to do so in order to introduce him as the antagonist of the film, and to also let us be in the moment with Gondo, in real time, as he reacts to and grasps with the situation at hand.
3000万円用意じゃ。何 ?3000 万円番号の揃ったのはごめんだ。
Number 3, how much do we hear? Do we hear the whole conversation from start to finish, or do we only hear parts of it? Sometimes Kurosawa will cut immediately after the phone has been dialed, as in this scene where Gondo calls Yokohama PD, and we skip the entire subsequent conversation to the inspector's arrival, probably because we pretty much already know what the content of that conversation will be, that Gondo needs their help, so let's just cut and keep the story moving. Other times he cuts to reframe the conversation in a different manner, like in the climactic last call of the film. Here we start in the telephone booth with Gondo, hearing both sides of the conversation. But just as the kidnapper is about to reveal his plan, Kurosawa cuts outside, effectively removing us from the conversation and leaving us on the edge of our seats. Number 4, when does the conversation happen? By that I mean, do we hear the conversation in the moment as it unfolds, or do we hear it as a recording after the fact, moments later or even days later? In the moment keeps us involved and lets us feel the urgent immediacy of the scene. By contrast, recordings are more detached and observational. The further away we are from when the conversation happens, the less emotional and more procedural it becomes.
もしもし。近藤だ。近藤さん。
Number 5, mix it all up. For any one conversation, don't get bound by sticking to any one area of the things discussed so far. For example, for Who's on Call, Kurosawa often keeps it dynamic through movement and cutting, switching from solo to surveillance, or surveillance to family to surveillance. Or for Who Can We Hear, this conversation starts as us only hearing Gondo,
私の息子をさらった
only to suddenly switch moments later by mixing in the kidnapper's voice.
よく聞け。あなたの子供は私がさらった。
And be sure to combine each of the previous 4 topics for interesting results. Specifically speaking to how much do we hear and when does the conversation happen, in this call we start with Gondo in the moment as he picks up the phone to answer, and then quite dramatically a wipe skips over the entire live conversation to a recording of it after the fact. It's such a completely jarring move, you have to wonder why Kurosawa cuts it this way. Well, I think it's because 6, he creates a narrative relationship between the style of each conversation in the film. There are 10 total phone calls in high and low, and so far we've only observed each one by noting and observing a few key differences in their presentation. But one thing we haven't done is talk about the relationship between them and how they fit in the broader context of the story. Something which, if you've seen my last video, is always an important consideration in film. Doing so here actually reveals something super cool, which is that each phone call style and presentation heavily builds off of the style and presentation of previous ones. To see this in action, you'd need only consider the first few calls in the film. Here's the first one, we've seen it before, can't hear the voice on the other end, mysterious, piques our interest, very cool. Here's the second, also can't hear the voice on the other end, mysterious again, and gets us more used to the idea of phone calls as a recurring motif in the film. Now the third, which starts off like the first 2 as a harmless one-sided conversation, but as we've seen before, suddenly changes in tone and severity after this moment when the kidnapper's voice is revealed and finally mixed in.
よく聞け。あなたの子供は私がさらった。
By looking at the relationship between these first 3 calls, you begin to notice that Kurosawa presents the third one in the style of the first 2 in order to trick us into thinking it'll be the same. And the key factor that changes in the third one, aside from dynamic camera work, is that we finally hear a voice on the other end. The first and only voice Kurosawa ever wants us to hear. Setup,
どうした 話はついたか？ん？
Setup,
あ、もしもし。あ、俺だ。
punch.
私の息子をさらった？冗談言うな。
And what happens when you've already landed a punch? Well, another one wouldn't have the same impact as the first, so why not keep things interesting with a kick?
あ？私が権藤ですが。何？私の息子をさらった？冗談言うな。
This analysis was focused on phone calls, but its core idea extends well beyond them. If there's some sort of element that's repetitive in a film, it's important to consider ways to change it up or present it in different ways in order to keep it interesting and hold the audience's attention. Or maybe not. Maybe the repetitiveness is a thematic point where you want the audience to feel a certain monotony in the story. As long as you're aware of the options that you have my blessing in whatever you do with this knowledge. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. If you'll excuse me, I have to take this. That was pretty cool, right? How I linked all of that together. Really very cool. You should subscribe just based on that. That's what I would do. That's what I would do. Just saying. Just saying.